Welcome to this Insolvency Service podcast. I'm Adi Daramy, your host, and joining me today is Nick Howard, who's the head of IP regulation in the Insolvency Service. Nick, thank you for joining us.
That's not a problem.
Now, in a recent Insolvency Service newsletter, you mentioned that you were enhancing the role of the Insolvency Service as an oversight regulator. And I'd like to explore what you meant by this and why did you feel there was a need for an enhanced role?
Well, a number of independent commentators in this area have stressed the need for an enhanced role for the Insolvency Service as an oversight regulator. So I'm picking up on those comments really, and I'm trying to put that into action. We had, for example, the Biz Select Committee report, which really picked up on concerns that were being expressed around how effective the regulatory system was, and they were very keen to see greater action in this area. We've then had independent reports on the insolvency on various aspects by the Office of Fair Trading and more recently by Lane Kempson looking at the issue of IP fees. And each of those have picked up on strands where they felt that actually regulation could be enhanced. And certainly from my own discussion with stakeholders, the people who are ultimately impacted by the actions of IPs, there's a lack of confidence out there that actually the bad guys are taken care of. So for all of those reasons really I felt that the step change is required.
Okay, so taking all these things into consideration, what are the measures that you've put in place to actually try and improve things?
We've done a number of things really, one of which is already in place, which is the complaints gateway. So insolvency practitioners will probably be well aware of that. That's now been operating for over a year. We've been looking to introduce greater transparency into the way in which monitoring works, and there's a number of measures which we're trying to take forward which will increase publicity around the work that is done by the regulators. And as part of that we've issued our own revised monitoring guidelines, which is a structure within which we work, and by getting it out there hopefully everybody can see the way in which it might operate.
Well, you've mentioned these things, so shall we take them in turn? Just first, let's start with the complaints gateway. Can you explain what it is and how it works?
Yeah, I suppose the main point from an outside perspective of the complaints gateway is that it provides a single point of access for anybody who wishes to complain about an IP. And previously what somebody would have had to do, they'd had to understand the regulatory system, they'd had to find out which particular regulator was in charge of that particular IP they were unhappy with, and then try and work their way through that complaints process. Whereas we've tried to publicise the idea there's just one place that you need to go to, a one-stop shop, and we think that will be a massive boost for accessibility. We think it will enhance prompt handling complaints. We have internal targets, complaints will be dealt with within 15 days and either turned down or passed on to the relevant RPB. And the gateway will carry out some fairly low-level filtering of complaints. So if they are written by somebody who clearly just hasn't understood how the system operates, the gateway will operate to reject that complaint and just provide information rather than treating it as a complaint. And probably finally actually the thing that the gateway does is it gives us information. So we're starting to gather a lot of useful intelligence now about what sort of complaints are received, where they come from, which particular insolvency procedures create lots of complaints. So all of that is really useful to target our activity in future years.
Okay, taking that, what are the sort of headlines from this and what are the things that you've gleaned from the first year of the operation of the gateway?
Well, certainly stuff around the nature of complaints, and probably what we'll find is that as time progresses that may change. At the moment a lot of complaints relate to IVAs, and particularly the way in which they're kept held open, a lot of which is to do with PPI claims being made. So that seems to generate a lot of complaints from the debtors, and that's been very noticeable. IVAs probably do seem to attract more complaints than other procedures, but we think over time we can pick up differing themes that rise across the complaints, and we can then look at those in our monitoring of the RPBs. We can also pick up information on how many complaints get passed through to each individual RPB, and eventually we'll start to get information about how they deal with those complaints, how swiftly they're dealt with, what the outcomes are, and that will be very useful for us in trying to form a view as to how effective the whole IP regulation world is.
Okay, great. Would I be right in thinking that not all the RPBs are on board?
That's very true for the Complaints Gateway. Yes, 2 of the RPBs are not yet signed up. I think the idea would be that everybody was signed up. The vast majority are, so the vast majority of IPs are already covered, but we'd like to see it universal, and we are working on it.
Okay, so that deals with the gateway. You mentioned monitoring guidelines. What are these guidelines intending to achieve, and where exactly do they come from?
Well, we're not unique in the insolvency world in finding that we're under pressure to improve our regulation. There's a lot of guidance around from government, and it's all about better regulation. And certainly that doesn't mean more regulation. It means maybe better targeted, better focused, with a focus on outcomes rather than just on outputs. So we've translated that into our very own monitoring guidelines for use across the insolvency profession. It's meant to be there to be helpful to both the RPBs and to IPs, because you can see how it is we intend to go about our business. It's a reflection probably of the greater transparency that we'd like to bring, the idea being that actually the more you shine a light on what goes on, the greater confidence people have in it. I think at the moment people think there's very little regulation goes on, so it's good for people to see that actually things are happening.
Now, on a couple of occasions, you've mentioned transparency. Would I be right in saying that you attach some importance to this? And what does it mean in a regulatory context?
Yeah, so it's definitely an area that I attach a lot of importance to. And this is all about confidence. Confidence from the stakeholders in the regulatory regime. So if they're impacted by things that have happened in the insolvency field, they have some confidence that if things have gone wrong, there is a system there that will pick those things up. And it's really important that if justice is being done, and I have to say there's a lot of good work being done by the RPBs to deal with mispractice, but it should be seen to be done. So people will get more confidence if they see that action is being taken. So I'm talking about greater efforts to publicise the regulatory actions, both of the RPBs and of ourselves. If we're taking action, let's get it out there, let's tell people what we're doing, and that should help enhance confidence. So part of that, I think, is to do with us and how we go about our work in monitoring the RPBs. And one of the things we've committed to is to say, actually, in future, the monitoring visits that we do to the RPBs to look at their processes, we'll publish the reports that we produce at the end of that, so that people can see exactly what's been found, where we have concerns, where we found really good practice, because we'd really like to highlight that, and there's a lot of that going on. And overall then letting people see what's happening. And I just think this will have a powerful impact, particularly on the more informed element of the stakeholder confidence group.
Now, Nick, you've mentioned the publication of monitoring reports, and I just wondered, what's the frequency of these, and how soon after a report is concluded will it be published?
Well, they won't be very frequent. We only undertake our monitoring visits every now and then to the RPBs. So you'd only expect to see a full visit report, perhaps even once every 2 or 3 years for a particular RPB. But when they do come, they are obviously significant because of that. So you might expect to see a report maybe every 4 or 5 months, something along those lines. But in addition to the main visits that we do, we might also be doing some themed visits in future. And again, we'll be looking to publicise those reports. So eventually you will see a fairly regular stream of information coming out from us as to what we're doing.
Could there be a downside to this, shining too much of a light on it? Is there a downside to transparency? And might publication of disciplinary sanctions, for example, give the impression that not all is well?
Yeah, I think there is a risk there that if people see sanctions being applied, the immediate thought perhaps is, well, why weren't they found earlier? Or, they're all tarred with the same brush. But I think any moment of reflection would just make people realise that actually, no, what I'm seeing is a system which is working properly. And certainly somebody who thought there was nothing happening, all of a sudden their mindset will be, no, I can see that actually something does happen. And for somebody perhaps who was thinking, well, I won't bother to complain because nothing will happen, maybe in future they might think, no, it's worth my while. And all of these complaints are really good regulatory intelligence. So yeah, I can take the point. I can see that actually for some people it might be a downside, but to my view, overall it's just got to be the best possible thing we can do.
And what about the RPBs? How do you see their role in this? I'm sure you're aware that many commentators have suggested that there are far too many for such a small industry. What's your take on this?
Well, once the Secretary of State withdraws from IP regulation, there will just be 7 recognised professional bodies left in this area. But 7, a lot of commentators have said, still seems an awful lot for such a small industry. And certainly from my perspective, as oversight regulator, it does make life more difficult, because you are having to deal with 7 bodies for each of the themes that you might be reviewing, and trying to get a consistent approach across them, so that everybody reaches the same outcome no matter which RPB you go to. We obviously have procedures in place which help us, things like the JIC to ensure the standards are consistent, things like the gateway to help consistency. But it's always harder work when there's so many bodies to deal with. So from my point of view, yeah, absolutely, actually, ideally maybe a few fewer.
Now, I'm sure you will guess that insolvency practitioners will be paying quite a lot of attention to what you're saying. And of course, the question they'll be saying is, what does this mean for us? And what does it mean for IPs?
Well, I think the profession itself has had its own concerns about the effectiveness of regulation over the years. I don't think the belief is yet there that the real rogues are being dealt with. And every time when I talk to IPs, they tell me they know who these people are. Now, what I want is a system where those are exactly the people who are being investigated and, if necessary, taken out of the game. So I think it's to everybody's benefit that regulation is seen to be robust and effective, that the bad apples are removed, and that should allow the good guys in the industry to benefit from an enhanced reputation, but also, competitively, they're not having to compete against people who are breaking the rules. So to my mind, it's in everybody's interest.
Okay. Well, in closing, I didn't want to dwell here on the measures currently before Parliament which will impact on insolvency practitioner regulation, but can you outline for us just briefly what those measures are trying to achieve?
Yeah, of course. We do. We have a number of measures in the Small Business Employment and Enterprise Bill currently before Parliament. And the overall intention is just to boost the clarity of the purpose of IP regulation. We're introducing the idea of regulatory objectives. So actually, what are we all here to try and achieve in the regulatory sphere? Most of those are fairly obvious objectives that you would want. You'd want transparency, you'd want accountability and all these things. But we think by introducing them, it gives you a framework of conversation then, within which a conversation can take place, so that we can try and apply some common standards. That's backed up by a number of increased powers for the Insolvency Service as oversight regulator, because at the moment, the only thing we could do if we were unhappy with an RPB performance is to remove their ability to exist as an RPB. And really, that's not a very proportionate power, and it's unlikely to be used. So we think having a range of sanction powers, so that when we see that there is poor behaviour on part of an RPB, we can actively deal with it, we think that's very useful. And in reality, we think having that range of sanctions will make it less likely that RPBs will in any way indulge in any poor practice. It also gives us the power to directly intervene with IPs, so something IPs might be very interested in. We would only do that in public interest cases where we think public interest dictates, but it does give us that power to step in and say, actually, there's certain cases that perhaps we might feel we would take those on ourselves. And then interestingly, actually, as a backstop power, we've taken the power to introduce a single regulator. And what that's saying is, look, if none of this works, and if at the end of the day there's still a great lack of confidence in the insolvency regime, the regulatory regime, well, we have the ability to introduce a different way of doing things. It's not the intention. My intention is to make the current system work, but it's there and can be used if required.
Nick Howard, Head of Insolvency Practitioner Regulation at the Insolvency Service, thank you for joining us on this podcast. I'm your host, Ali Darami. Join me next week when we tackle another subject. Thank you.